Have you ever been in a situation where beforehand you were really excited? Like maybe it was something you had to train a lot for. Maybe it was a new job that you were excited to start, or a new activity, new sport, new craft, new something. And you were so excited. But then the moment you were about to break through and do it, you start hearing that voice in the back of your head. And that voice starts telling you, you're pretty ridiculous for thinking you can do this. Or that voice starts saying, hey, you're going to be the worst one out there. You probably shouldn't waste your time. Or that voice starts telling you you're not good enough, you're not this, you're not that. And you start hearing that voice. Has anyone ever been there? Okay, good. I'm not alone, because I'm about to get a little vulnerable if you guys are okay with that. And I want to tell you a story about my life. I used to be really into sports, and not just like now where I'm kind of old, out of shape, and I just watch sports, but I used to play sports. I love playing sports, baseball, football, soccer. I did track, all my life. Then I get out of high school and all of that competition stopped, and I missed it. I missed competing. So I figured, okay, I'm going to get really into running. And I started running 5Ks. And then those 5Ks led me into 10Ks. And then before I knew it, every single Saturday morning, I would wake up, I'd get in my car, and I'd drive somewhere for a race. Sometimes I would drive hours just to run a 10K, which seems kind of ridiculous because I was driving longer than it would take me to run the race. And then it got me to the point to where me and my best friend, some of our times where we would just hang out, Friday night, all my friends are hitting the bars and going out crazy, partying, and me and my best friend, we'd be like, let's just go run for 15 miles. That sounds like a way better time. And that was our version of hanging out. And then it got me dreaming and got me hoping. And I set a goal that I was going to run a marathon. And sure enough, my hometown, I grew up in Pennsylvania, they were having the Great Pocono Marathon. It was called Run for the Red. It was this marathon, and I'm like, yes, I'm in. This is my shot. I'm already running 15 to 18 miles 2 to 3 times a week. What's another few miles to get over that 20? So I sign up, and anyone who's ever signed up for a marathon, they are really expensive to go run. But I sign up, I spend the money, and then that's kind of when my brain starts ticking a little bit. And it's like, hey, what are you thinking? The guys who win these things normally run it in 2 hours. That is way faster than you can run it. And then my brain starts going, everybody who actually knows how to run is probably going to see you in your form and just completely make fun of you behind your back because you don't really have any form. You're just doing this for fun. These guys take it way more seriously than you. What are you thinking? And I'm trying to get these thoughts out of my head. I already paid the money, okay? I had already dropped some change in that. So the day of the race comes, I get in my car, I drive down there, I go, I register, I pick up my packet, I put my cute little bib on, my shirt, and then they gave me this chip that's, GPS, I don't know, in case I fall out and they notice I'm standing still for too long. I don't really know what that was for, but I have to unlace my shoe, put the chip on, I lace back up my shoe, man, I stand up. I'm wearing my fresh outfit because anybody who's ran, it's better to be seen. So got this fresh outfit, got my bib on, got my chip on, and then I walk back to my car, get in it, and drive home. I'd let that voice in my head win. That voice that was telling me, what are you thinking? Look around you. There are people with way shorter shorts, which means the shorter the short when you're running, the better the runner you are. My shorts are down to my knees. It's what are you thinking? You can't do this. And I let the voice win. I didn't run a marathon that day. I got in my car and I went home. Has anyone ever been there? You let the voice in your head win? And it didn't end there because then I got home and I was kind of ashamed of myself. I did all this stuff and then I started feeling so bad about myself. I actually kind of got out of running after that. And that's the exact point where we find Moses in this story of the game plan. if you guys have been following us throughout this series, this is the exact point that Moses has already proved himself. Okay, he was living in a palace, and he steps out of the palace because he is so upset with the social injustice of his people, that his people are literal slaves, and he gets so upset. He leaves the tower and he does something admittedly terribly wrong. Don't kill anyone. But he comes out of the palace. He gives up the entire life. He actually stands up, fights, gets ran out of the town, and has to go live by himself. The Bible says for 40 years, getting ready for this calling. And then finally, every single day, he's crying out, God, my people need you. And finally, God responds after 40 years of preparing Moses. God responds and he says, Moses, I hear you. I hear the groans of your people back in Egypt. We are going to free your people, Moses. All I need you to do is step up, go back to Pharaoh, and tell him to free your people. And then this is Moses' response in Exodus 3:11. But Moses said to God, physically, face to face with God, he says, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? After 40 years of preparing, he goes to God and says, God, who am I that I should be doing this? And here's what I like is when God responds in the very next verse. And then God said to Moses, he said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign that you and to all of Egypt that it is I who sent you. I love this response by God because God doesn't try to give Moses a false sense of confidence. He's not like, hey, Moses, you're the greatest guy ever. That's who you are. That's why God doesn't spend whole bunch of 12 verses. He doesn't spend the rest of Exodus just building up the confidence of Moses. He kind of just agrees with Moses. He goes, yeah, Moses, you're right. Who are you? Who are you to be doing what only God can do? That's God's response is, I agree, Moses. Who are you? Okay. God's reassurance isn't that Moses can do it. God's reassurance is that God will put the right presence in your life. God's reassurance was that, Moses, I will be with you. I will be speaking for you. I will be in you in every step of this process. God's reassurance is that very first point, if you're following within the bulletin, is that God puts his presence inside of you. So no, Moses, you can't do it. I agree, but I can. God can. And that's God's response. Sometimes accomplishing your calling, sometimes accomplishing your vision that God has given you has a lot less to do with who you are. Has way more to do with who God is. Are you allowing God to speak into your life this morning? When those little voices start saying that you're not good enough, that you can't do it, that you're crazy, what voice is louder? Your voice or God's voice? For me, when it was the great Pocono Marathon, the Run for the Red, it was definitely the words of doubt as I got back in my car and I drove home. For Moses, even though he was face to face, audibly speaking with God, he still had all these doubts. He was still allowing his internal voice to speak louder than God's audible voice. But when you allow God to put his presence inside of your life, it stops becoming, who am I? Which was Moses' response. And it starts becoming, how can God? God may be calling you to do something, but he never said he wasn't going to be right there with you. God will never call you to something that he will not be with you for. So if your calling or your passions scare you, if your calling or your mission that you think you're supposed to do seems way too big, it seems way too hard, It seems out of reach, or the gap between your ability and the success of your vision seems like the Grand Canyon. Good. You found the spot that God's supposed to be. Are you allowing God to fill that canyon? You know, God puts the right presence. He puts himself in your life, and he has designed it so you use him. You allow him to speak for you. You allow him to guide you. But even in that response from God, because that was God's response to Moses, was, Moses, let me do the work. You just need to step out. So even with that response from God, Moses wasn't ready to fulfill his vision yet. Wasn't ready to fulfill his calling. You know, if we look at Exodus 4:11, Moses then answers God. And he says, what if they don't believe me? What if they don't listen to the words that I'm saying? What if they say that the Lord didn't appear to you? What if they say that I'm making all of it up? And if we keep going, God responds. God responds to Moses as he will respond every time you ask him a question. And the Lord said, what is that in your hand? And Moses says, it's a staff. It's a stick. Moses looks down and he sees the physical object that he's holding. And he says, it's a staff, or a dowel rod from Lowe's. And here's what I love. God asked Moses, what's in your hand? And Moses just literally looks in the natural. And he says, it's a stick. I got a stick in my hand, God. And I after I bought this, I took it and I would walk around the office and I would just give it to random staff members here. And they would take it and they would look at it and I'd say, hey, what can you do with that? And the very first response was, I don't know, hit somebody with it. Oh, defend myself. And then I started asking probing questions, right? Started getting a little bit deeper, and I'd say, hey, you think you could build something with that? And then they would give me an answer, and then I said, hey, do you think you could create a game and maybe play with it? You think you could use this at work on your job? Do you think you could feed your family with this stick? You know, this stick, this dowel rod, was created for really one purpose, right? I originally put a JC Kids flag on it and carried it to camp. But when you start getting creative, you start thinking outside the box, this stick, this staff, starts becoming so many different things. You know, in an athlete's hand, this might be stickball. If you guys are old enough to remember baseball, you know, baseball with a really skinny bat. You know, in the chef's hands, maybe you can use it to like stir up some syrup or something. I don't know. You know, in a musician's hand, maybe it starts becoming a percussion instrument. You know, maybe in a real big pinch, you can shave it down to a point and go fishing with it. I saw the movie Castaway. That's exactly what Tom Hanks did. You know, in your life, this dowel rod, you could start fires with, you could play with, you can work, you can feed your family. It stops becoming a stick, it stops becoming a staff, and it starts being exactly what you need it to be. You know, the Lord said, Moses, what's in your hand? And Moses said, it's a staff. And God said, throw it on the ground. You know, what do staffs do when they hit the ground? Make a loud clang and then fall over, but not this staff. This staff fell, and the moment it hit the ground, it turned into a snake, and Moses saw the snake and ran because he was afraid of snakes, evidently. And God said, Moses, get back there, grab it by the tail, pick it up. And Moses goes back and he grabs the snake by the tail and it turns back into the staff. You know what God was telling Moses is it doesn't matter what is in your hand. It matters what you do with what I put in your hand. In that moment, Moses saw a staff, but God But God said, no, Moses, that is not a staff. That's a plague to let Pharaoh know who's in your corner. No, Moses, that is not a staff. That's a tool that we're going to dam up the Red Sea and free your people. You know, church, you may look down and you may see the staff in your hand, but God sees an exit strategy to the promised land. What you see as nothing special, God sees as a tool for freedom for somebody's life. All you need to do is be quiet long enough for God to use what he's already put in your hand. God puts the right thing in your hand. Even when you don't think it's the right thing, even when all you see is the physical object or the tool, God sees a miracle. God sees the blessings that can come from that tool in your hands. God sees the salvations that come out of it. Maybe you just need to start seeing kind of the bigger picture and stop seeing the physical object. Maybe when you realize you do more than just sing in your car. Maybe you get up here and you lead people into worship so that they can maybe meet God for the very first time. Maybe what you realize is just you think you're grilling hot dogs because you got a big grill. It was really a tool that we raised hundreds of dollars to send hundreds of kids to camp, many of which had salvations and we baptized right here. Maybe you need to realize that what God is putting inside of your hands is really the right thing at the right time that you need exactly to lead your family, to reach hurting people in all of central Louisiana, maybe to bring the addict some healing and freedom, maybe to feed the poor, to help the widow, to bring souls before God, to dive into hell and take the souls back that Satan has tried to steal. What you have in your hand, Journey, the physical thing that you have in your hand are the tools of God himself. And maybe you just need to start believing that this morning, because God will put the right thing in your hand for his timing, whatever it is. But guess what? Some of you guys are going to amen me this morning. I heard some amens, but you're still going to go home and say no to God. Let me say that again for effect. Some of you guys are sitting there thinking, yeah, you're right, amen. And then you're going to go home and you're going to say no to God. And I know this because that's exactly what Moses did. Moses finally got to the point in Exodus 4:13 that he's just run out of excuses. You know, everything God had an answer for, every single excuse, and finally he runs out of them. And in Exodus 4:13, Moses says to God, he says, "Pardon your servant, Lord. Can you please just send somebody else?" Because God has answered everything. God, I'm not good enough. You're right, Moses, you're not. Take my presence. God, all I have is a stick. Yeah, you're right, it's a stick, but with me, it could be miracles. And now, God, can you just send somebody else? I don't want you to keep proving me wrong. Send somebody else. And this is God's response in verse 14. Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses. Can you imagine having a Bible scripture about God's anger burning against you? The Lord's anger burned against Moses. And he said, okay, what about your brother, Aaron? I know he can speak well, and he's already on his way to meet you. You know, there's a lot to unpack there. You know, was God finally fed up with all the excuses? No, maybe. I would have been, but God's God. But what I really want to focus on is the little bit at the end in that. He, Aaron, is already on his way. God already had Aaron on his way. Why would God have Aaron on his way if God was giving Moses a calling? And I think really that's two main reasons. The first one, and go ahead and write this down if you're taking notes, God has already taken into account your ignorance. You know, God gave you the calling, but he also made you. He already knows your strengths. He knows your weaknesses. He knows your tendencies. He knows more about you than you even know about yourself. And because he already knows you, he already knows how thick-headed you're going to be when he gives you a calling. And then the second reason, I think, is because God never said you had to do it yourself. God never said you had to do it yourself. Just because God gives you a vision, just because God gives you a mission, doesn't mean that God expects you to do it on your own. God created us to do life together. We saw that in Adam and Eve. God made Adam, and after a while, he was like, oh, wow, this guy really needs to do life with somebody, so he made Eve. God gives you the calling with the assumption that you will need other people. And what's also true is other people will need you. You know, God knew that Moses wouldn't understand this, so God puts the right people in your life. Now, that doesn't mean that every single person is going to be the right person in your life. Let me say that again. That does not mean that every single person in your life is going to be the right person. You know, sometimes you got to be careful who you share your visions with. Sometimes you got to be careful with who you share your goals with. Some people are like vipers. They're just going to tear you down, just to tear you down. Some people, you know, have you ever like been so excited about something? Like, man, I remember leaving my friends and God had just called me to be a pastor. And you share that with people and they're like, well, that's dumb. You know, they don't make any money. You know, that's a huge waste of time. You know how impossible it would be for you, almost 30 years old, to completely change your profession, go into something else? I don't know, Jesus did it, but... And Pastor James is actually going to be preaching on that in a little bit, how Moses allowed way too many people to start speaking into his life, and it just completely crushed him. So make sure you come back to hear that. But moral of that is the wrong people will kill your goals. But the right people will lift you up. The right people, no matter how uncomfortable it is, are going to hold you accountable. It's what you just said you're going to do. The right people are going to help guide you in whatever your calling is. The right people will stand on the sidelines and cheer for you. The right people will help silence the sketch and amplify God's voice in your life. You know, I didn't finish my marathon story that I started telling you earlier. I did not run a marathon that day, so that does not end well. But And as I said, it killed my joy for running for a while because I started just closing in on my own head. But many years later, many years later, God brought somebody into my life. Somebody who I kind of opened up and I was like, yeah, no, I used to be really into running. I actually wanted to run a marathon one time. I know that sounds crazy. And they were like, no, it doesn't. That doesn't sound crazy at all. That person pushed me to get back into running. That person pushed me into joining a running team. Yeah, I was on a whole team that we would meet once a week and we'd just go run together. You know, this person helped me by researching running plans on the right running plan to get me back into how many miles I should be running a day. That person helped me by running with me. They would actually come out and run with me. Can I get that picture on the screen? You know, we would run together. We would go to church together, and then one day, myself and my girlfriend, who that's now my wife, by the way. We did later get married, still are today. She puts up with me, but at the time she was my girlfriend. My girlfriend and I, we signed up for our very first marathon together. Lake Placid, New York. I'll never forget. We went to the training grounds from an old Olympic site, and we get there. I put my bib on and I start remembering. That time I put the bib on. That time I put the chip on my shoe. And then that picture is 20 minutes. 20 minutes from the sound of the gun going off. And she would not let me hear any voice but God. And I said, well, what if we come in last place? And she said, yeah, but what if we just finish it? I said, well, what if other people make fun of me? And she goes, who's going to make fun of you? They're going to be too tired. We're all running a marathon. And we got out there and we finished our very first marathon together. God will put the right people in your life. That's a promise. You know, I didn't have to try to complete my dreams of doing it alone, because when I was alone, I had nobody building me up. When I was alone, I had my own mind speaking louder than God. But when God put somebody in my life, what we accomplished was a dream. You know, Moses, he didn't have to go before Pharaoh by himself. It was God's vision given to Moses. And every weakness that Moses had, Aaron had that exact strength. Moses didn't speak elegantly. Aaron could give powerful speeches, but had nothing to say. God would give Moses exactly what to say to Aaron, and Aaron would go before him and speak. You know, God showed Moses that with the right people in your life, whatever you view as a weakness turns into a strength. You know, God showed Moses that with the right people, if they have the right heart, if they believe in your vision, they can carry that vision with you. God showed Moses that you could stack your team. Any weakness that you have, you can get a godly vision carrier on your team to build you up. And all of a sudden, you go before Pharaoh by yourself, standing there, stuttering with nothing to say, to going before Pharaoh with God, with people who believe in your vision, and with the right objects in your hands. It's crazy to think that God will put the right people in your life if you let him. If you let him, if you get around the right people. You know, God has already put the right things in your hand. You just might not know how to use it yet. But all of that means absolutely nothing if you don't have what my first point was in that bulletin. All of that means absolutely nothing if you don't have God's presence in your life. You know, God promises to be our guidance. God promises to be our peace. God promises to be our biggest fan and silence every little voice in your head that's telling you you're not good enough, that's telling you that you can't do it, that's telling you that you're already defeated. God promises to silence all that. But you need to have God in your heart first.